Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Julie Fisowich, the Director of Learning and Exhibit Development at the Saskatchewan Science Centre. Today, we have a very special guest, is Tyler Morhart, a scientist working at the Canadian Light Source. Welcome, Tyler.
Hi, Julie. Thanks for having me.
So first of all, can you tell me a little bit more about Canadian Light Source and what it is?
Sure. I'll just share some slides with you really quickly. I've got some pictures teed up, and it looks like you have to enable participant screen sharing. So your first lesson of science, kids, is that in science, you get to figure out every piece of video conferencing software ever invented. Let's see if this works.
Let's try that.
Okay, there we go. So let's see if I can make this full screen here. Full screen, please. There we go. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides. Can you see those, Julie?
Yes, I can.
Awesome. Okay, so the question was, tell me about CLS, basically, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I work at Canada's only synchrotron. So this is the Canadian Light Source in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Let's go back. So CLS was built almost 20 years ago, actually. I mentioned it's the only synchrotron of its kind in Canada. It's one of approximately 20 third-generation synchrotrons worldwide. So this is a national laboratory in my hometown, actually, which is pretty cool. So this is the exterior. In lieu of taking you inside for real, I will show you a very cool panorama of the interior. So there's two levels. The level that I'm showing this photo from is the mezzanine level, which overlooks what we call the experimental hall. So this is a big picture. There's lots going on, but all of the tubes and such that you see, that basically defines the storage ring. And on the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about how this works and what the storage ring actually is. But for the purposes of this slide, I'll just tell you that the Canadian Light Source really is a truly massive machine. It's a light source in the sense that exactly that. It produces a variety of different energies of light, ranging from the mid-infrared all the way into X-rays. And scientists use that light to do all kinds of interesting different things. So let's go to the next slide and tell you how this thing works. So one of the reasons that CLS was actually built in Saskatoon was that there was already an accelerator laboratory called the Saskatchewan Accelerator Lab that was in site at the University of Saskatchewan. So that basically got subsumed and turned into what is now Canadian Light Source. So on this nice poster that the people in communications at CLS have helpfully made for us, I'll just guide you through this. So the left-hand side, there's a schematic. Number one is the Electron Gun. So the Electron Gun is exactly what it sounds like. It is a giant source of electrons that blast them at relatively high energies into our linear accelerator section. So that's the blue section entitled 2. I am not an accelerator physicist. I'm a chemist by training, so I can't tell you how this works. But essentially, through some physics magic, we ramp up the energy of those electrons and ultimately dump them into 2 stages. First, a booster ring, which is the pink ring labeled 3 at the left-hand side. On the photo at right, you can actually see that pink ring is trying to pick out the inner smaller ring in the synchrotron. So in that booster ring, we boost the energy of the electrons up even higher to the point that they're very near the speed of light. And then we dump them into the storage ring. And in the storage ring, they circulate, and then they go through a variety of different sections that ultimately peel off portions of their energy and emit beams of light of varying energies out towards individual beam lines. So there are about 20 different beam lines in CLS. And I'll mention that the majority of them, like each beamline essentially functions as an individual laboratory. So each beamline really is a highly specialized sort of section built to a particular kind of experiment, extracting a certain kind of information about a sample, something interesting, say a piece of a plant, or perhaps a battery material, or a crystal of a protein that's relevant for biomedicine. And so I'll mention that the majority of the beamlines do what I just described, what I would call analytical techniques. So they're using light to study the structure and changes of matter. But my lab's a little bit different. I work in SILMOND. So the SILMOND beamline is the Synchrotron Laboratory for Micro and Nano Devices. What's that mean? Well, unlike the rest of the beamlines, which use light to understand the structure of matter, we use light to alter the structure of matter. Why do we do that? Well, it's basically the challenge is that machining on the micro and nano scale is impossible with conventional machining techniques. Think about how you might build a house or maybe machine an engine block. You're going to use tools that, you'd be familiar with maybe from like shop class in high school, or you'd see a mechanic or a carpenter working with. You can't do that when you're talking about things that are the size of a human hair or less. So when we say the Synchrotron laboratory for micro and nano devices, we mean micro and nanos in like micrometers and nanometers. So the image that I'm showing you here, this is a scanning electron microscope image that was made before I started in Silmond of our logo. So what's going on here? So each of those little posts that you can see, so the raised letters, the little ovals, or I don't know, oval-like shapes that are raised, those were actually created using a process called X-ray lithography in basically a polymer. So you notice the scale bar in this image, it's about 1 millimeter. That means that I could take like 3 or 4, maybe 5 of my hairs and lie them across this, this tiny raised logo and completely cover it. This is really, really small. So that's what my beamline is focused on, meeting the challenges of how do I machine something or build something that is, on the scale of a human hair. How do we do that? I want to show you this photo because I think it's really cool. So basically, we do this in a process that's very similar to conventional film photography. I realize basically nobody does film photography anymore, so maybe this will fall on deaf ears, but let me give it a shot. So in film photography, you take a film negative, you shine light through it onto a photographic paper, and then you know that you develop an image on that photographic paper. And there's a chemical reaction there, I won't go into that. We basically do something similar with X-ray lithography. So instead of using a photographic negative, at the left-hand side there, you can see this nice big circular thingy. Let me just see if I can get a laser pointer here. Can you see my laser, Julie?
Yes, I can.
Awesome. So what I'm circling here is what we call an X-ray mask. This is a lot like a film negative. What we do is, through a very complex process, we build up the negative of the image we want in gold. So all the yellow stuff you see there, all these structures, that's gold. We like gold because it's a really good X-ray absorber. And then we have to put it on something that's not going to absorb X-rays. So in this case, I think this one's graphite, but there's lots of options. And then what you do is you take your photographic paper. I don't know if you can see my video, but I'm doing air quotes. You take your photographic paper, which for us is just an X-ray sensitive polymer, which we call a photoresist. So this is just like a plastic, a film, basically. We put it on a substrate, usually a nice flat silicon wafer, and then we slap it onto the front of this, this mask. And I'm not showing you this, but this guy is actually housed in a truly massive piece of equipment called a scanner end station. Basically, it exists to support the wafer while we irradiate everything with X-rays. And just like when you take a photograph, or I should say when you develop a photograph, so X-rays are absorbed by the gold, they pass through the graphite in this example, and then they selectively expose the photoresist underneath. Why is that important? Because then we have the photoresist, this polymer, is now exposed in areas that basically correspond to the image we want. And all we have to do is dunk it into a solvent, which we call developer, and then essentially selectively dissolve away the areas that we don't want. And then we're left with an image or a structure much like what I just showed you on this slide. So that is the kind of crash bang introduction to how you might machine something that is on the scale of hundreds of micrometers, so scale of a human hair or so. We do some other things as well, so I'll just quickly show you this picture. We're also very interested in something called microfluidics. Microfluidics basically comes down to the science of manipulating very small quantities of fluid. That's interesting because, first of all, if you imagine that you have a bucket of reagent and you're like, I want to do chemistry with this, but it's very expensive. Using less of that reagent is obviously very important. It's cheaper. But you can also do some pretty fundamentally cool things with the physics and chemistry on these small scales. We can talk more about that later, but I'll just finish by saying that we have a range of interests in Silmond, all of which are tied together by our ability to make very small devices. So I'll just stop sharing my screen now. Yeah, that's an idea of what my lab, my beamline, Silmond, does at Canadian Light Source. Other beamlines are focused on, there's a protein crystallography beamline that is focused on sussing out what is the structure of the chemical machinery, the biochemical machinery that helps us all go, the proteins that basically do all of the important reactions in our body. Other beamlines are interested in heavy metals that are present in, say, soil, or in understanding how cathode materials for batteries or fuel cells work. Those are a few of my favorite examples.
Wow, that's really cool. There's so much interesting research that's happening there. You talked a little bit about your lab and the area of research, but is there anything else that you wanted to talk about with your research? Or maybe I'll just, yeah, what are some cool things that you've worked on in the past?
Okay, so I'll put the cart a bit before the horse and I'll show you my screen again.
Sure.
Let's see. So I am actually still a graduate student. So I'm still working on my PhD. Let's go forward. Come on now. There we go. So I'm very proud of this. One of the things that I did as a graduate student was this. So we'll talk more about this later on in the interview, but this is essentially the back half of my PhD project. On the table here, this is, believe it or not, this is actually a microscope that I designed and built myself with help from some very talented scientists at the mid-infrared beamline, as well as my supervisor. So this is an infrared microscope. I won't talk about the rest of this, which is all devoted to infrared spectroscopy. But basically, I'm a chemist, so I went from knowing almost nothing about optics to being able to build a fully functioning microscope in the course of about a year. I'm glossing over all the parts that were really hard, and I had to learn things I never thought about before. Yeah, and I'll just quickly plug my experience in graduate school by saying that part of the fun of scientific training is that you get to do things that you would never expect yourself doing. So getting to get up to my elbows in building a custom microscope completely from scratch, that was really, really exciting. So, oops, I think, there we go. I think I'll leave it there.
Sure, that'd be exciting to hear more later. It's always interesting with learning how you can actually, one thing that you learn can get you so excited about a whole bunch of other things. That's always, it seems like your experience there. So there's a lot of research happening right now, focusing on COVID-19. What can you tell me about the research you were part of and how it relates to researching the pandemic? Oops.
Right. So I should say that I'm very lucky that I've been able to go back to work and start working on a COVID-related project and potentially one or two more. I can't talk about the details of the project because it is under a non-disclosure agreement, but I can tell you that we're using the techniques that we have in Silman to build micro and nanoscale devices to start developing a device that could potentially be helpful for assessing whether or not somebody has COVID-19. I think that's all that I can tell you, unfortunately.
Oh, that's really cool, though.
So just to talk about the impact of that, it's, I've found it, I've been working from home for about 3 months. So I found it quite hard to do that, mostly because my family and loved ones are all in medicine, actually. So all of my family are nurses, basically. So these are people that are working on the front lines. Whereas I've been, I'm quite lucky to be able to work from home safely. So being able to contribute in a fairly small way, and really in a way that I think is, not 100% sure to give us good results, but is potentially very impactful. That's part of the benefit, I think, of doing science, and I've been very thankful to be a part of that.
That's awesome. We were really exciting to follow that research as it goes on, and we can hear more about it. It's really great that different areas of science can all work together to kind of help the situation that we're all in right now. So that's really awesome that you get to be a part of that. So you mentioned before that your research focuses a lot on being able to make a tool to study something. Can you explain that a little bit more? What does that really mean as a chemist building something?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the image that you get of scientists, particularly in like high school science, or maybe if you take a little bit of university science, or even if you watch a movie, you have this image of a science as somebody in a white coat who walks around, and as a chemist, you swirl test tubes, you write things down on a clipboard, and that's essentially it, right? But I would argue that the story of scientific progress over the last 200-300 years is also the story of the advances in the tools that we use to understand the world around us. So you think of Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who invented the microscope, I think, sometime in the 1700s, maybe the 1600s, or Galileo's invention of the telescope. These are just tools, right? But the revolution that they brought about in our ability to understand the universe around us in terms of cellular life in the case of the microscope, or in the structure of the universe, really, or the solar system in the case of the telescope, without those tools, we would not have been able to gain the insights that we really rely on every day. So it might seem odd to say that as a chemist, someone who thinks about, what does matter look like on the micro, like really the nanoscale, the atomic molecular scale, a lot of my day-to-day existence is devoted to building tools like the microscope that I showed you on one of those slides. And for me, this is really where my passion is, because I realized fairly late in life that I actually really like working with my hands. I didn't realize this until I was in university. And I had no idea starting an undergraduate degree in chemistry, mostly because I had a really good high school teacher. I had no idea that I would get to the point where what I do on a day-to-day basis looks more like what an engineer or what a car mechanic would do than what you think, the cartoon picture of a chemist would look like.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, building things is definitely not what you normally see of a chemist. You do get that, I think a lot of people would get that image of the chemist in the lab with like a test tube and some kind of experiment that probably actually isn't as related. So that's a really cool way of looking at the career as a chemist. Your research and the area study might surprise people because of that. And how do you think that difference from that classical image? You already kind of touched on this.
Yeah. So what the question is, how do I differentiate myself from that image of like the guy in the white coat, basically?
Yeah.
Well, okay, I'll just describe my day a little bit, maybe. I think that could be potentially helpful, because
Sure.
I don't think people realize what scientists do on a day-to-day basis. Like a lot of my day involves administrative stuff. So like, reading publications, keeping up with the literature, sending emails to collaborators, more so now because we're all working from home. But then a lot of my day will look like, okay, we've identified a goal where, in the case of the microscope that I showed you, our goal was, can we take a picture essentially of a very simple chemical reaction happening in a microfluidic device? We just wanted to take two liquids, flow them together, and watch them react. To do that, we had to sit down and design from scratch this microscope. So that looked like placing an order to this company called Thor Labs, Thor Labs, and getting a bunch of mirrors and parts. And then I spent, several months basically in a closet, essentially doing what looks like scientific Lego, tinkering and putting things together, realizing I'd screwed it up, taking it all apart, having my supervisor come over, realizing he'd screwed it up, taking it all apart, us going and having a coffee and be like, okay, this doesn't work clearly. And then finally getting to the point where we've built something that we think is potentially useful, and then carting it all the way over to that mid-infrared beam line that I just showed you. So, I mean, I would say that if you think of the stereotypical scientist doing like the scientific method you learn like high school, formulate a hypothesis, design an experiment, do the experiment, collect data, analyze results, do that cycle. That is a very sanitized version of what a scientist does on a day-to-day basis. A lot of what we do is, hey, would it be really cool if we tried this? Try the thing for an afternoon, screw it up, go away, come back, and then keep doing that over and over and over until you realize, hey, holy cow, I think I actually understand something. And it's really only then that you can actually start to formulate the correct hypothesis, because the hypothesis, the goal can move very slowly as you realize what your capabilities are. So, hopefully that gives you an idea of why my day-to-day existence is a little different from like the canonical idea of a white coat clad scientist. Does that answer your question, Julie?
Yeah, for sure. It really does. Yeah, it really does. And I think it kind of leads into the next question that I have. And it's, if there's a young person, say they're in high school still, or maybe just first starting in university, what would you, and they weren't sure about what they wanted to study or what they wanted to go to in school, what would you say to them about, your career path and the things that you learned about going through school?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So let me tell you a bit about me. I am extremely lucky to have gone to a school in Saskatoon that had really good science teachers. I was part of the first, I think our school was the first one in the province to get an AP chemistry class. So I have to give a shout out to Mr. Norman Lipinski, my chemistry teacher, who was just an unreal individual, like a truly, truly spectacular communicator of science. So essentially, I went to school for a chemistry degree knowing nothing other than this is really cool, and Norman Lipinski made it seem cool. I mean, at 18, I argue that you rightfully do not know anything about what you want from a career. And I mean, I'm pushing 30. I still don't really know what I wanted of my career. I shouldn't say that. I don't know specifically what I want for my career, but I know in general what I like. So that's what I did as an undergraduate. I followed my interests. I thought, okay, maybe I want to be a science teacher. Then I realized that chemistry was really cool. So I thought, okay, I'll finish my chemistry degree. I did a math minor because I was interested in that. And then I took a year off, didn't really know what I wanted to do, and decided to go to graduate school. Because for me, I'll say that graduate school, working towards earning a doctorate, I knew that in graduate school, I would get a chance essentially to follow my own curiosity and acquire skills that you otherwise really can't. Like nobody else in the workforce is going to tell you how to take apart a $100,000 infrared spectrometer and just like throw bits out of it and then rebuild it essentially. It was stuff like that I knew interested me. But then going through my undergraduate and then through graduate school, again, I didn't know exactly what job I wanted. And I think that's a subtle distinction, but it's an important one. Because very often people ask you, what do you want to be when you grow up? And, I would have said a paleontologist until I was about 10 because dinosaurs were and are still super cool. But then honestly, I couldn't tell you for the longest time. So saying I want a particular job and then gearing yourself towards that job, maybe that works, for something well-defined like, law or medicine, maybe. But otherwise, I think for me, my approach was, I just want to learn cool skills. And my bet was that by learning cool skills, I would find a niche that I would fit in really well. And I'm very, very lucky to have done that. So I guess the lesson there that I draw from my experience is focus on the skills that you can acquire and be willing to take unconventional paths. I'm the first person in my family to go to graduate school. I think I'm actually the first person in my family to get a university degree full stop. So that was not an obvious route for me. Yeah, I'll stop at that, I think.
Yeah, that's super cool. And just kind of that idea of being able to pursue kind of something that you're really interested in is just so great. You kind of mentioned this, and you might have had other inspiration, but you're mentioning your teachers as being someone who really got you into science
Sure.
and interested in that. Did you have any other inspiration that made you want to enter a career in science?
Yeah, they built a synchrotron in my backyard. I said it before, I'm from Saskatoon. I was like in middle school, right? Basically when CLS was announced and started to be built. So I actually did a project, I think when I was in like the 7th grade on the Canadian light source. And I remember my dad coming home one day with a newspaper, and I think this is the Saskatoon Star Phoenix, and it had run, I think either a front page story or somewhere in the middle of the paper. It had run this great giant graphic of how the Canadian light source worked. And it was very similar to the slide that I showed you earlier on. And I was like, oh, this is super cool. So I turned it into a poster. I gave it as a presentation. And this is 15 plus years ago. So, I was always very cognizant of the fact that there was this really, really cool national lab in the backyard. And again, I'm from Saskatoon. This is a flyover province, I think, in a lot of people's eyes. But for me, it was really, really, really cool to see that, science could come to Saskatchewan in a big way. This wasn't something that you had to go away to do. There was a career, there's a future for people that are interested in science in my home province. That was really exciting to me.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely interesting, because I think a lot of people do think, oh, well, if you're going to invent something or create something or make this like big discovery in sciences, you're going to, somewhere in the US or somewhere international, yes. Or even in a larger city. So, knowing in Saskatchewan that, the light source does so much amazing research is really cool.
Can I say one more thing about that?
Sure,
Julie?
yeah.
So one thing I want to mention is that, you have this image of science as a global pursuit, right? So, you can go to California, or you can go to like the northeastern United States, or you can go to Southern Ontario and go do science. And the idea is you can go do science that benefits the whole world, right? And this is largely true, but it ignores the fact that there's lots of places for what you can think of as place-based science too. I want to highlight the fact that Canadian Light Source has, I think possibly the first and only agricultural program on a synchrotron in the world. Mm-hmm. So, like, obviously this is Saskatchewan, and agriculture is a huge part of our economy, our history, our livelihood. So the fact that a national science facility can start to build, pardon the pun, build roots in this local environment and do research that really will start to benefit and is benefiting local farmers and people that look like you or I, basically our family members. I find that really, really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Definitely that interconnection too of, the history of Saskatchewan and being so ingrained in producing and farming, and the synchrotron, seemingly not being related to agriculture is in such a big way. Yeah. That's a really cool, way that Saskatchewan's interconnected with each other, but also worldwide. So you've mentioned this too about kind of career options for someone that's entering in sciences, but how diverse are the career options for someone who is interested in sciences?
Right, that's a good question. I would say incredibly diverse. Yeah, and part of the problem with that is it's really, really hard to predict what kind of science jobs will be out there tomorrow, in a year, in 2 years. But speaking broadly, I also during graduate school I started a company that commercialized some of the things that I was working on. So I mentioned I build tools. I started a company that commercialized and started selling one of these tools to scientists around the world. So that's been really cool. I've been part of that for about 2 years, and I knew nothing at all about running a company. I did not know at all that I was interested in business, but I was really surprised by how much fun I could have as a scientist in business. Because really what that means is that, if people are buying the things that you sell, that means you're filling a need. And as a scientist, that's really validating to say, hey, something that I built is directly helping out someone who's like me, who's a graduate student, or is a new prof, or someone who's just interested in basically making the world a better place. The fact that I can be a part of helping them do that, that was really, really exciting for me. So I don't think it's obvious to most people that there's a substantial role of science in business. Basically all of the biggest companies out there right now have a scientific aspect, I would say. Basically every car company has a battery or fuel cell division, and they hire scientists. That's one specific example. So I'll just say that keeping an eye on business as a scientist, that's potentially quite important. And then of course there's research too, right? People expect that you can just go off and you do graduate school, you become a professor, and you do science for the rest of your life. That's becoming increasingly hard to come by. There are a lot of PhD graduates, particularly in Canada, but it's basically worldwide, and a decreasing proportion of jobs as professors. It's very challenging to get those jobs, which means that if you're thinking about a career in science, my advice would be to recognize all the jobs you can have that are not becoming a professor. Because for me, I think the odds of becoming a professor when you start your undergrad are approximately the same of becoming, an NHL hockey player, basically, when you start playing hockey as a kid. It's just really unlikely. This is not to discourage anyone. If you're committed and in some places you get lucky, you can absolutely have a career as a professor. But jobs like mine that are kind of academia adjacent, as a staff scientist, jobs in industry as scientists, or as business people, basically, and then even jobs in the nonprofit sector or in government. Like the federal government in Canada hires scientific policy advisors. It's people that are educated and understand the science, that they go and advise the government on matters of science policy. So basically what I would say is that if there's something you're interested in besides science, like you're a very committed activist, or you're really interested in changing lives, or you're really interested in building companies, you can do that as a scientist. It's just not obvious how you can get that career path. That's what I would say.
Yeah, that's really neat, because I think you could have that idea of, if you have two interests, like, you mentioned something about, being interested in science, but also business, or if you're someone who's interested in science and an art career or something like that, there's so many connections between different areas.
Can I say something about science and art?
Yeah,
right.
sure.
So there's a really cool program, I think primarily on the mid-infrared beamline at CLS, that is taking great Canadian works of art and is using, the mid-infrared beamline is one of them, and it's one that I'm very familiar with, but there's certainly other beamlines involved. It's using the synchrotron to understand what pigments are used in great Canadian works of art. How is that changing? How they degraded? There's a whole really interesting body of work devoted to using really powerful scientific tools to understand great works of art and how they change over time. Super cool stuff. So that's just another example.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before, about how most scientists that we know also have that creative aspect to them, that interest in something artistic. And so I think sometimes the classical image of a scientist isn't someone who is very creative, but most scientists that I think both of us know are very creative people.
Yeah, I think you could basically describe a scientist, and in many cases I think this applies to engineers as well. You can describe scientists as quirky people that know a lot about one particular thing. uh, like you said, every scientist that I know has an interest in some kind of art or performance or music. One of the things that we do at CLS is we have a semi-weekly coffee time. So we all get on Zoom and we have coffee together. And one of the things we've done is just have people that can play instruments just play an instrument. They play the guitar or the piano while we all drink our coffee and listen to them over Zoom. So that's a lesson in how much artistic interest runs through the scientific community. Scientists are people too. We're just like you. We eat and we make music and we enjoy our lives and we have interests besides hanging out and writing things down on clipboards.
That's fun. So one other question here. If you can predict the future, what areas do you see as most exciting or hopeful? I guess, where do you see, research in general, or maybe your own research going, particularly at CLS?
Sure. Okay, so I'm a scientist, so I'll qualify this by saying that I think that predicting the future is excruciatingly hard, and there are very few aspects of the future that we can predict very well. I'll tell you what I'm optimistic about. So I mentioned I'm under 30. I'm hoping to live a good long life, which means that before the end of my lifetime, the changes that humanity is causing in the earth will grow more and more extreme. I hope that I don't need to convince this audience that climate change and the global warming process associated with it is potentially catastrophic and deeply, deeply concerning. Now, that said, I'm optimistic that science can make a surprising amount of difference. Now, I won't say that I expect that in 20 years there'll be a miracle and suddenly we'll be able to just grab all the CO2 out of the atmosphere and sequester it. But I think it's very hard to predict when great scientific leaps will happen, and it's hard to recognize them as well, because civilization changing things happen all the time. Look, 20 plus years ago at the rise of the internet or the development of the internal combustion engine. These are things that 10 years before, 20 years before, you could not have predicted and seem utterly obvious in hindsight. So I'm hopeful and kind of optimistic that in 10, 20, 30 years, I don't know, hopefully before the end of my lifetime, we will have a much better handle on, the fuel side of the problem, getting away from our dependence on fossil fuels as fuel and using them more as feedstocks for the complex materials that we rely on. So not just burning them and throwing a bunch of CO2 in the atmosphere, essentially just so I can go drive and get an ice cream, but potentially also technology devoted to carbon sequestration, capturing it. I don't know. I don't know what will play out and be the most successful. But I am optimistic that science will play a very important role and that humans are astonishingly capable and brilliant. And we will find ways, if not to cope, potentially to help mitigate some of the challenges that we're facing. And then obviously, we're recording this in the middle of a pandemic, aren't we? That's been very encouraging to see, that the rate of scientific communication has been immense just since January, February. I remember the first few papers coming out about COVID-19 at the beginning of the year, basically. So there's been a fire hose of information released, and it's being shared in an open manner by scientists in China and in Europe and in the States and in Canada and in Africa. I'm very hopeful that as a scientific community, we can continue to keep reining in this pandemic, and then hopefully think about how we can change structurally for the better to prevent this next time, basically. Yeah, that's my view.
I think the one thing in the last few months, I think if we learned anything, is predicting the future is difficult, but that hopeful,
yeah.
The hopefulness of what, research and science has for people, it is really there. So that's a really good point to make. Was there anything else that you would like to share with us about your research or about the CLS?
No, I don't think so. Other than to say that I'm very thankful to have been interviewed by you. I'm from this province, so obviously I went to the Saskatchewan Science Centre as a kid. This is pretty cool. Yeah, I think I'll leave it with thanks very much for your time, and I look forward to hopefully talking to you when all this pandemic stuff is over.
Yes, thank you so much, and hopefully everyone enjoyed listening to you as much as I did.
Very good.
So
Thanks, Julie.
thank you very much.